Hi guys, GrandJ here and welcome to another one of our videos. Opus 7 has just recently released, and today's video we'll be talking about the new Earth cards of Opus 7.
The first card we'll be talking about is ASMODAI. He's a 5-cost 8,000 power forward, so he's a little bit below the curve. He's one of the new 4 general cards. When ASMODAI enters the field, choose one dull forward an opponent controls. If the cost to play ASMODAI was only paid with Earth CP, break it. So we actually have a lot of cards in Earth that have a very similar effect to this card in that they penalize your opponent for having dull forwards, and this card is a pretty nice way to deal with that. Compared to cards like Cecil, these cards usually have some sort of restriction in regards to what sort of forward that they can break, or when their effects can be used. So in ASMODAI's case, his drawback is that you need to pay all Earth CP in order to trigger off this ability. But if you are considering playing this card in a mono Earth deck, then it's a very powerful card. Although the body is a little bit smaller than what I would have liked, his ability is pretty unconditional, and being able to break any sort of dull forward is actually pretty strong for this card's size and cost. Unfortunately, the biggest drawback of this card is that he's probably going to be played in a mono Earth deck. That's where you'll most likely be able to trigger off his ability. But mono Earth decks don't have that many ways to dull forwards proactively. Sometimes your opponent can have priority targets that you want to get rid of, but those priority targets aren't forwards that are going to be attacking, and ASMODAI won't be able to hit them. So unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to use this card as a proactive play, but as a responsive or a reactive play, he's very good for what he does. Next card is VANILLE. She's a 4 CP 7,000 power forward. When VANILLE enters the field, choose one dull forward, select one number and reveal the top card of your deck. If the revealed card is the same cost as the selected number, break it. Also, she has an S ability, Poison Guard, for S Earth Dull. At the end of your turn, dull all forwards your opponent controls. So her first ability is very similar to ASMODAI's ability that I spoke about before, in that when she comes into play, she can break a dull forward. So it's a part of the Earth archetype that they have ways to destroy dull forwards as a part of their abilities. Unfortunately, the drawback on this card is actually pretty severe. Now, there are 2 ways to kind of get around this. You have to effectively predict what the cost of the top card of your deck is. So you either build your deck with primarily 4 costed cards, so you have a very high likelihood of hitting the card that you want to hit. Alternatively, the better way to succeed with this is probably playing Earth Ice and using a backup called YOJIMBO, which happens to be in Final Fantasy 13 as well, so there is a little bit of synergy there, where YOJIMBO gives you the ability to look at the top card of your deck, and combined with VANILLE, this will give you an almost consistent way to break dull forwards when they enter play. As for VANILLE's S ability, Poison Guard, this card's effect isn't particularly strong, but it is reasonably costly for what it does. Now, it doesn't prevent your opponent's forwards from being able to attack because it does dull them at the end of the turn, but this does set up your opponent's forwards so they are dull, which means that all your Earth cards that break dull forwards will be able to have targets when you play them on your following turn. So this effect isn't that great when you compare it against cards like Ice or Lightning, but considering if you want to play a more mono Earth elemental deck, then this does give Earth ways to dull opponents' forwards, which is something that Earth quite desperately needs. The big issue with this card is that the first ability is a ability that you generally want to be playing with a dual color deck so you can support it, and the bottom effect is one of those effects that's only required if you're playing a mono Earth deck, which kind of puts this card in a very weird position. Do you play it in dual element, or do you play it in mono element? If you play it in mono element, the first effect becomes very difficult to trigger. If you play it in dual element, the second effect is kind of unneeded, especially if you're comboing it with YOJIMBO, in which case Ice has a lot of ways to dull your opponent's forwards. So this card has a lot of flexibility. It can be played in either situation, but one effect is much better than the other in each of these situations, unfortunately. That being said, if you do disregard the second ability, her first ability is very strong on a forward of her cost and her size, so it's quite good. And if you do want to play a Earth Ice deck, I think this is a great inclusion for that. Next card is CARBUNCLE. He is a 2-cost backup, and his ability is Back Attack, which means he can be played like a summon or ability, which means he can be played during your opponent's turn anytime you have priority. So Back Attack is an ability that we don't see too often, and it's good to see this ability come back a little bit in this set. Now, this card has a couple of very interesting applications. The first relevant application for it is that you get to play this before your first turn if you are playing second. So if your opponent chooses to play first, during your opponent's turn, before you've even started your first turn, you can always discard a card to put CARBUNCLE into play, which means when it comes back to your turn, you'll have one active backup available, which means you'll be able to play odd costed cards on your first turn. Now, this is kind of interesting for what it does to the game in that you can play much more heavily amounts of odd costed backup, because typically it's very inefficient to play a free costed backup on your first turn. So having CARBUNCLE on your opponent's turn and having it active so you can play your free cost backup on your turn is actually pretty cost efficient and very useful for CARBUNCLE. Now, another reason why CARBUNCLE might be relevant is that it can trigger enter play abilities, especially backup enter play abilities on your opponent's turn. So these cards generally are more wind-based cards, so cards like Balthier or cards like Dorgan. these cards will be able to combine with Carbuncle, allowing you to trigger off their abilities during your opponent's turn, which can be a very nice, interesting surprise in certain situations. However, because Carbuncle is a unique backup, you'll only be able to pull this effect off once in a game, or you're forced to break this backup in order to pull this trick off again. Now, the third application of this backup is that it can be a very safe backup to put into play. You don't have to put this backup into play during your turn. You can always wait during your opponent's turn, and then when you have the CP or the cards available for free, then you can always put Carbuncle into play, which means that you can hold Carbuncle and the 2 CP that you would have used to put him into play until your opponent's turn, and after you've confirmed that your opponent has no further plays during their turn, you can put Carbuncle in as a very safe backup, and he'll be available to be used on your turn when you start. So this is a pretty handy trick that you can have with Carbuncle, and it gives the Earth deck a way to ramp their deck up, but also have the resources available in the early game if they need to hold back responses. And this by extension means that if you are playing against a discard heavy deck, you can always hold an Earth card and this card in your hand, and always play this in response to your opponent's discard effects. So overall this card is pretty flexible, but because it doesn't really push into any specific archetype, it's just a useful card. But besides from this card having a lot of flexibility, it doesn't really push any sort of archetype, and it doesn't have really much more utility to forward a deck's strategy. And because of that, I think it's going to be very difficult to get this guy into any competitive strategy deck. The next card we'll be talking about is the first Earth Legendary of the set. He is Galuf. So first of all, he is a 5-cost forward at 9,000 power. He is a Job Dawn Warrior. His abilities are, Galuf cannot be broken during your turn. When Galuf attacks, choose one forward, you may pay Earth. If you do so, it must block Galuf this turn if possible. And his S ability is for just one S, choose up to 2 forwards, they cannot attack this turn. So overall, this card is actually pretty good value for what it does. The fact that it can't be broken during turn is really strong. It means that this card is going to really emphasize his ability to attack and fight, because there's going to be very few situations where your opponent is going to be able to punish you for having Galuf attack during your turn. This subsequently synergizes very well with his second ability, which allows you to choose one of your opponent's forwards to block it if you pay 2 Earth, which for 2 Earth is actually a very reasonable cost for this sort of ability. And because Galuf is a 9,000 power forward, he's generally going to be able to run into most forwards that he's causing to block. So these two abilities cause this card to be much more like a control card. So it's a card that you can put into play, and if your opponent doesn't deal with it, then you're going to slowly get advantages on your opponent. And this is especially relevant when your opponent is just playing it forward every turn, and they can't do anything relevant or useful with that forward. You can then get Galuf to run over every single turn, so you're just gaining card advantage with this card. His third ability, Stop, actually also plays into this synergy pretty well. So while you have Galuf on the field, if your opponent has any high value targets, they may want to try to attack with their targets in order to force them to being dull, so they can't block Galuf. So this ties into his special ability, Stop, pretty well, in that you can cause 2 forwards to be unable to attack that turn, which means that they are available to block on the following turn if Galuf wants them to block. So all of these abilities synergize into Galuf very, very well. Unfortunately, the biggest drawback with this card is that he is quite an expensive forward, and he has no immediate value or impact on the game, which means after you play him, he's vulnerable to your opponent's removal abilities during their turn. So you have to find a way to keep him protected, either with Cockatrice or Titan or some other type effect to keep him alive during your opponent's turn. If you can do this, you're guaranteed to get value out of him on your following turn. That being said though, there are plenty of ways to get this guy in for free or to cheat him out. Now the first way to do this is using cards such as Star Sybil, which allows you to break it to put a forward into play, or by using a card such as Kelgar, which synergizes with the Dawn Warrior archetype, that can potentially allow you to put him in for free as well. So when you consider the options that are available to put Galuf into play for free, especially with Star Sybil and Kelgar, this card can actually be a forward that you put into play for free. If you do take that into consideration, this card's value becomes significantly stronger, because all of a sudden you are putting this very powerful forward on the field, has a strong control effect, and it's very difficult to remove, and you can get it for potentially free. That's really good value, and I think this card is going to be quite strong, and I think it's kind of slept on a little bit right now. But as the Opus 7 metagame develops a little bit more and more, I definitely do think Dawn Warriors, especially the Wind Earth Dawn Warriors, is an archetype that I want to try experimenting a little bit more, especially when you combine with Star Sybil. You can have big blowout plays where you can put in a free Kelgar, and then that also gives you a free Galuf, which is a huge amount of value for effectively 1 CP breaker backup. The next card we'll be talking about is KRILE. She is a 4-cost 8,000 power forward. Her job is Warrior Light, so there is a couple of bonuses there, and she has 3 abilities. First ability is, the cost required to cast your summons can be paid with CP of any element. Second ability is, when you cast a summon, choose one forward against plus 1,000 power until the end of turn. And her third ability is, discard a summon until the end of turn. KRILE cannot be chosen by your opponent's abilities. So this card reminds me very, very much of a card that we got in Opus 3 called Garnet. Effectively, all 3 of KRILE's abilities seem like a remake of Garnet's abilities. So KRILE does allow you to play summons using any CP of any element, which is very similar to what Garnet does. However, do note, even though you can cast summons using any CP, you don't actually create multiple elements of CP. So this card doesn't combo with a card, say Cactuar, in that you're still only using the CP that you're generating to place Cactuar, even though you can technically use any colors of CP in order to generate it. KRILE's second ability of when you're casting a summon, choose a forward to give it plus 1000 power until the end turn, seems like a watered down version of Garnet's ability as well. Whereas Garnet's ability gives all your forwards plus 1000 power when you play a summon, KRILE only forces you to select one forward to give it plus 1000 power until the end of turn when you cast a summon, so it's a significant downgrade from it as well. As for her third ability, allowing you to discard a summon to make her unchoosable by abilities, again, this is very similar to Garnet's ability in that Garnet can't be chosen by your opponent's summons, whereas KRILE, you can discard a card to make her unchoosable by opponent's abilities. So KRILE is very much another Garnet, but seems to be a much more underwhelming version of her, although in a more earthly style type effect. Ultimately, I don't think that there's much reason why you would play KRILE over Garnet if you want to play a strategy more along these sort of lines. The only one benefit that KRILE does have over Garnet is that she is a Warrior Light, which does give her little benefits in that she has a lot of synergies that she can take advantage of, especially being in Earth, which has a lot of advantages given to Warrior Light support already. That being said though, Garnet is also a card that has a lot of support within her own category as well, so overall I don't think that this KRILE really pushes into this archetype much better than Garnet does. Another alternative use for this KRILE is that it does synergize very well with the 2CP KRILE that we got in Opus 3. Her two S abilities, Spellblade Firer and Spellblade Thundara, are both very strong abilities, but they require an extra copy of KRILE in your hand in order to cast them. Now, they were powerful effects back then, but the biggest restriction is that there was only one KRILE in the game. Now, having a second KRILE in the game does give you a lot more options in order to use those abilities. While the first ability, Spellblade Fire, is probably not as relevant as it was back in the day, Spellblade Thundara is still very powerful in the modern metagame, and it could be a very good card to have an extra KRILE for in your hand. Overall, this card is fine. It's got a lot of interesting things that can be useful in a lot of interesting ways. Her name is KRILE, her job's Warrior Light, and she's got summon support. But ultimately, she's kind of a jack of all trades. She does a little bit for a lot of different things, but she doesn't do any particular thing very well. And when it comes to building a deck with a very specific strategy, you always want your forwards to be king of their trades. And unfortunately, KRILE, because it's not one of those, it unfortunately is lacking. Next, we have Kolka. He is a 4 CP backup. When Kolka enters the field, you may search for one Earth forward and add it to your hand. There's not too much to say about this card. He's exactly the same as all the other elemental searches that we had before. Melwib in water and Ysayle in ice. So this is just Earth's equivalent of that exact same backup. Obviously, he can only search for Earth forwards as well. But those cards have been pretty relevant in their specific archetypes. More so Melwib, because you can search for very specific targets in the case of Layla and or Vikings. Kolka will probably fulfill the same role within Earth, in that you can search for a very specific Earth card. Kolka can fulfill a very similar role. He either allows you to search for any of your Earth forwards in a mono Earth strategy, so he can be used as a toolbox sort of backup, but also in Dual Color decks where you want a specific Earth forward pretty early on in the game, Kolka does give you a way to access those forwards consistently in most games. So Kolka really can be used in either one of these scenarios, and he's a solid. And because Earth has been a reasonably strong element in the recent couple of metagames, Kolka is definitely a card that I can see being played in the current metagame. The next card we have is Zagnal. He is a 2-cost monster, and he's the Earth's equivalent of the transforming monsters for this set. So his ability is, when a character costs 6 or more enters the field, Zagnal also becomes a forward with 9000 power. This effect does not end at the end of turn. This ability will not trigger if Zagnal is a forward. So when you consider that you are getting a 2 CP 9k forward with this, it's actually pretty good cost value for what it does. Generally for a 9000 power forward, you are expected to pay at least 4 or 5 CP in order to get a forward onto the field like that. So you are effectively getting a 2 to 3 CP discount on Zagnal when he transforms into a forward. Unfortunately, his restriction is a little bit more difficult to achieve than other monsters in the game. The most likely way that you'll be able to transfer Zagnal is using SHANTOTTO. But don't worry, this actually works in your favor. Because Zagnal and SHANTOTTO both trigger when SHANTOTTO enters play, you can choose the order of resolution of these two effects. All you have to do is add Zagnal's ability to the stack first, and then add SHANTOTTO's ability second, which means SHANTOTTO will resolve first, clearing the board, and then that causes Zagnal to transform from a monster to a forward. When you consider this as a combo, it's actually pretty good, because you can bank up 2 or 3 of these Zagnals, play SHANTOTTO to clear the board, and then all of a sudden you've got 1 or 2 9k forwards that your opponent has to immediately deal with, as well as having no board to deal with it. So that's obviously the most optimal situation of you playing Zagnal. Alternatively, Zagnal also can trigger off his ability if you play a character card that has become cheaper, but has a higher base cost. So a good example of this is having PRISHE this set. Her cost is reduced for each card named PRISHE in your break zone. So even if you only paid, say, 3 or 4 CP to put PRISHE into play, effectively because you've played a 9 cost character, or a character of 9 cost, even though you didn't pay that much, allows you to trigger off Zagnal's ability as well. So do take into consideration any situation where you are playing large forwards and they are cheaper than they usually are. Unfortunately, the big thing that really holds this monster back is that it's a 2-cost monster. In a weird and ironic way, had this monster been a 3-cost monster instead of a 2-cost monster, he might have been better. Because currently, most of the monster removal in the game is targeting monsters that are cost 2 or less, so Zagnaw unfortunately does sit in that threshold. So there exist cards like Zell and Ramuh, which will be able to destroy Zagnaw very easily as a part of their effects. So because of that, Zagnaw, while he is pretty strong and has pretty good synergies within Earth, unfortunately, because he is a 2-cost monster, he might be very easily dealt with, especially in a metagame right now where a lot of decks are running monsters, so subsequently a lot of decks are running monster removals, and most of the monster removals in this game are all targeting monsters that are 2 or less. The next card we'll be talking about is Shantotto. She is a 2 CP backup, and her ability is pay 1, name 1 element other than light and dark. Shantotto becomes the named element until the end of the turn. You can only use this ability once per turn. Now there might be a couple of reasons why you might use this card's effect. The first reason is that you might want to color fix, so if you want to play a specific card of a specific element, and you don't happen to have a backup of that element on the field, Shantotto can convert itself to a backup of that element, so it is possible to use it that way. Alternatively, there might also be other situations where certain forwards or certain abilities will require you to have more cards or more characters on the field of a specific element. Shantotto can convert herself in those situations to get that number a little bit higher and to allow you to achieve those thresholds a little bit easier. So those are the positives of Shantotto's effect. However, her biggest issue is her name. Because she's named Shantotto and she is a backup, it unfortunately locks you out for playing the 7-cost Shantotto, which is a very, very, very powerful Earth backup that I think most, if not all, Earth decks want to run copies of. So almost because of that reason alone, this card is unplayable. As for her color fixing ability, having to pay 1 CP to change her element is actually pretty costly for the benefit that it gives you. And within Earth itself, there are already plenty of ways to help you color fix or to create element CP outside of Earth, such as using cards like Leo and such as using the new Moogle backup. Because of that, Shantotto's effect isn't that good, and because she's named Shantotto, is probably the biggest restriction on this card overall. So unfortunately, because of all these reasons, Shantotto won't see play. The next card we'll be talking about is Summoner. He's a free CP 7000 power forward, so he's a on-curve forward and he's a standard unit. When Summoner enters the field, choose one forward. If the cost paid to play Summoner included ICP, freeze it. This card, in my opinion, seems quite underwhelming. Earth already has a lot of forwards and backups and effects that can break dull forwards, or having a free CP 7000 power forward that does nothing but freeze a forward, and he has to have a ICP in order to do so. It seems underwhelming in my opinion. I think in a lot of cases, if you have access to ice, playing a card like Vanille would be much better than paying the free CP in order to play Summoner just to freeze a dull forward. Additionally, if you have access to ice, then there are generally a whole lot of ways in ice itself that you can dull or freeze forwards. And if you're an Earth deck that already has access to Ice, then you're probably going to want to play Vanille and Yule as a combo as opposed to playing Summoner using Ice CP. So overall, considering all the hoops that you have to jump through to use this card's ability, and the ability's payoff isn't particularly good, I don't think this card is going to see any sort of competitive play. The next card we'll be talking about is XEZAT. He is a 4 CP 8000 power forward, he is a Dawn Warrior, and he's got an interesting 4 abilities. For Earth, XEZAT gains plus 2000 power until the end of turn. For Earth Ice, choose one dull forward, deal it 4000 damage. Earth Wind, choose one forward, activate it. And Earth Lightning, choose one active forward, deal it 4000 damage. Now it definitely seems that a lot of these Dawn Warrior cards are going to be very, very heavily played in a control-orientated deck, and this is another card that definitely screams out control deck to me. If you just take into consideration, if you just were to play him in a mono Earth deck, having access to that first ability is actually pretty strong. Paying 2 Earth CP to give this guy plus 2000 power is really good if you just have it on demand. It makes it so this forward is very difficult to remove with damage removal as well as in combat as well. Just having access to that ability to just pump himself up is very, very flexible. If you go down the path of Earth, Wind, Dawn Warriors as well, it gives him access to his second ability, which allows him to activate forwards, which in a lot of cases is pretty strong, especially considering how Earth has a lot of very powerful forwards. Having them active on defense is very good. And playing against certain matchups like Lightning or Ice, having that ability on demand to reactivate a forward as many times as you want during the turn is actually pretty good. If you play him in Joy Element decks, then he has access to his 2 other abilities. Either you play him in Earth Ice, where he gets access to the ability to deal 4000 damage to a dull forward, which is very good for 2 CP. Or alternatively, you play him in Earth Lightning, where he can do the same but for an active forward. Now, the fact that you can repeat these effects as many times as you want during a turn, as long as you have the CP, is actually very strong. It means that once you do get your backup line set up, then having this forward on the field and protecting him sufficiently will allow you to gain a constant amount of control and resource advantage over your opponent. That being said though, Earth has a lot of ways to create different elements from their backups, whether it's in the form of 7-cost Shantotto, or whether it's in the form of the new Moogle backup, or whether it's a form in a card like Leo. Mono Earth by itself has a lot of ways to produce other different elements of CP, and effectively by a Mono Earth deck by itself can allow you to have access to all 4 of these abilities. Now, depending on which method you use to generate CP of other elements, it does determine how often you can repeat his effects. If you have a card like Moogle or Leo on the field, you basically have free reign to use any of your backups to use his second or his fourth ability as much as you want. So while this forward doesn't innately have any ongoing abilities or any interplay abilities, the fact that if you can keep him around means he places a large amount of pressure on your opponent and has a large control effect on the field. Subsequently, if you play it in any sort of Dawn Warrior deck, you can play him out for free. So definitely this is one of those cards that you can't just chuck into any sort of Earth deck. But in decks that can take advantage or do build around his strategy or his ability, then this card is very, very powerful. And I do definitely want to try him out in a Dawn Warrior multicolored deck. The next card we'll be talking about is TAMA. It is a 2 CP backup from WoF. For Earth, Dull, put TAMA into Break Zone, choose one category WoF card in your Break Zone and add it to your hand. So overall, this effect is actually very well costed. On a 2 CP backup, which means you can just play it easily on your first turn, as well as being a backup that can break itself, gives it a lot of flexibility. And the cost of break it is actually pretty cost efficient as well. For just Earth Dull Break, you can return any category WoF from your Break Zone back to your hand. So at this stage, there aren't any WoF summons, so you can't take advantage of that. But otherwise, there are a lot of great targets for TAMA to revive. Whether it's in the form of a forward such as LAN or Huoyin or any of the monsters that came out from this set, or whether you want to pick up very powerful Earth backups such as Crow, Girl Who Forgot Her Name, or Masked Woman, these are all very good targets for TAMA to hit. So most of the best targets for this card will be in Fire and Earth, but there are relevant targets in other elements as well. Wind does have access to Cactuar Conductor, as well as Ice having access to both Sid WoF, as well as Babbliz. So overall, this card is actually pretty flexible, and if you have quite a large amount of WoF cards in your deck, then definitely this is a great selection for you to put into your deck. The next card we'll be talking about is Tilika, and this is a pretty exciting card. So it is a 2-cost forward at 5,000 power, so it's about on curve, and its ability is you can discard light and dark element cards from your hand to produce CP. Light cards produce 2 light CP, and dark cards produce 2 dark CP each. This card's actually a very powerful card, and it opens up a whole lot more different strategies and archetypes, being much more consistent. So at the very least, if you have Tilika in your deck, it means that it does allow you to have ways to get rid of extra light dark cards in your deck. So for example, if you want to play a Earth deck that favors you having a lot of damage, you're obviously going to want to play Fusoya in your deck. But if you run 2 or 3 copies of Fusoya in your deck, if you draw those extra copies, you can't do anything with them. But now with Tilika, you can always have her on the field and you can discard those cards for light CP to pay for your other cards. So while Tilika isn't a backup, which in my opinion, if it were a backup, then it'd be just an overpowered card, the fact that it is a forward means that you generally only want to play this forward onto the field when you need to use its ability. So generally you can just keep it in your hand and then put it down whenever you need to discard light or dark cards from your hand. And then if your opponent destroys it later on, that's fine, you've already gotten your value out of it. The other reason why this card is actually pretty powerful is that it opens up certain decks to play a larger amount of light or dark cards in their deck. So Camelot is a very powerful dark card and it encourages you to play more dark cards in your deck. However, at a certain threshold, it becomes much more difficult to play a certain amount of light or dark cards in your deck. Generally, if you're going 4 or higher light or dark cards in your deck, it generally becomes much more potential for you to brick out on your cards. So with Tilika, potentially we have a way to play potentially, 8 or 9 dark cards in your deck and still being able to use them to create CP if you have Tilika on the field. And it just so happens to be that if you were to play a strategy like that, there exists 2 cards already that are able to search for Tilika out of your deck on backups, whether it's in the form of Epitaph or whether it's in the form of Kolka. You can consistently guarantee that Tilika can be in your hand or be available play. And so it means that any time where you need to get rid of those extra light or dark cards in your hand, you can always convert them to CP to play cards when you have Tilika on the field. So while definitely this isn't the card that people wanted, it's definitely a powerful card, and it's a card that I definitely think people are sleeping on a little bit too hard. So definitely if the metagame develops a little bit more, I definitely want to experiment a little bit around with this card and play a larger, darker lineup of forwards or backups and then take advantage of Tilika's effect. The next card is Necromancer. It's a 2 CP backup for Triple Earth 1 Dull Break. Choose 1 standard unit in your break zone, play it onto the field. Now this card is a card very similar to a backup that we received in the past called Gladiator. But there are some distinct differences between the two. So first of all, Gladiator only costs Water Dull Break to bring a standard unit of 3 or less from your break zone onto the field. But you can only do it during your turn. So compared to Necromancer, you are paying 3 CP extra to use its ability, and you get the benefit of playing any standard unit and being able to play it during your opponent's turn. That being said though, I did a little bit of search online, and it seems like the best standard units in the game all happen to be around the 2 or 3 CP mark. And nearly all the standard units that are 4 or 5 CP are generally pretty lackluster. In a lot of cases, you'll probably want to play a named forward as opposed to a standard unit 4 or 5 cost card. So ultimately, because the payoff isn't that high and there aren't that many desirable targets, I think you're overpaying with Necromancer. And even if you were playing a value 3 cost standard unit forward onto the field, I don't think that paying the effectively 5 CP worth of cost and then breaking this back up is a relevant way or a cost-effective way to do so. So because of that, I don't think Necromancer is going to see much play, because it's just too expensive for what it does, and targets that it searches for is generally not going to be as good, and in a lot of cases, Gladiator is just going to be a better choice. The next card we'll be talking about is Noctis, and boy oh boy, this card is pretty fun. So he's the second legendary of Earth for this set. He is a free cost 7,000 power forward. EX burst, when you receive damage, choose up to 1 forward. If you have received 6 points of damage, break it. His second ability is when you receive damage, choose up to 1 forward opponent controls. Noctis and the chosen forward deal damage equal to their respective power to the other. And his third ability is for Earth 2. During this turn, the next damage dealt to Noctis becomes 0 instead. So let's break this down. Each of the 3 abilities of Noctis aren't particularly powerful by themselves, but when they're combined, all 3 effects on one card, it actually becomes a very, very solid unit. So first of all, his EX burst ability, where he can break it forward if you receive 6 points of damage, is pretty strong. But even though it says EX burst, in my opinion, I don't think it's a very relevant EX burst. You'd effectively have to hit this as your 6 damage in order to trigger it as an EX burst. And I really don't like those odds. Those odds are very, very slim. So in the case of this card, I almost don't consider it having EX burst at all. That being said though, it's actually a very strong, powerful insurance type effect. So if you do have him on the field, and you're, say, like at a high damage count, whether it's like 4 or 5 damage, having him on the field makes it much more difficult for your opponent to extend for lethal, because you have the option to destroy one of their forwards on the turn when your opponent tries to push you a little bit harder. As for his second ability, it's actually pretty strong in certain cases. So first of all, it's definitely strong against any sort of decks that want to dull your forwards, whether it's ice or whether it's lightning, or any way where your opponent wants to attack you directly without having to get through your blockers. Noctis gives you a way for Noctis to fight against their smaller forwards, because generally those sort of decks, their forwards are generally less combative than most of the Earth forwards. It's also relevant in situations where your opponent has smaller forwards on the field and then uses their larger forward to try to punch through. If your opponent's in a situation where they have some smaller forwards, let's say some Vikings, and they play a larger forward, let's say Cloud of Darkness or something, that Cloud of Darkness is definitely going to be stronger or larger than Noctis, so if it attacks through, it's probably not going to be blocked by your cards. But once it attacks through, it allows Noctis to deal its damage or exchange damage with another forward on the field, and in a lot of cases, it will be hitting a smaller forward. So any sort of strategy that has both large and small forwards, Noctis is going to penalize him quite hard. And thirdly, his ability to prevent damage to himself is actually pretty good. Now, it's definitely overcosted for what it does, so paying effectively 4 CP to prevent the next packet of damage to Noctis, you're paying a lot for it. But when you consider the fact that you're getting a lot of value out of his second ability and how well it combines with it, then it actually is pretty relevant or pretty fair for his cost. Don't forget you can use his ability on offense as well. So definitely you can attack with Noctis and then paying 4 CP if your opponent blocks with a larger forward, or if your opponent does something to cause the attack to trade or do something in a way that you don't like it to resolve, you can always use Noctis' ability to pay 4 to prevent damage dealt to him. And as long as he's on the field, it makes it much more difficult for your opponent to attack you directly and to create good combat trades. So that's just the card by itself. Now, there exists a lot of cards that are great combos with Noctis. So obviously, the first combo is Fusoya, which is definitely a card that I think is going to be much more relevant in Earth starting from this set. Being able to use Noctis' ability on demand with Fusoya's ability is actually very, very powerful. Not to mention other great combos such as like Cockatrice or Titan, which makes your Noctis not break or not receive damage for a turn. It means that his second ability you can just use with no issue whatsoever. Any situation where your opponent has a lot of potential attackers, if you can cast Titan or Cockatrice on your Noctis, even though your Noctis can't block, your opponent's probably just going to stop attacking. It's very difficult for your opponent to deal with every time they deal damage to you, for you to deal 7,000 damage to one of their forwards, or potentially more if Noctis gets buffed. And that's the thing, Noctis' power or his damage that he deals back to forward gets greater the stronger he is. So if you happen to have some ways to pump him up on the field, whether it's in the form of Necro or whether it's in the form of Ingus, it makes Noctis even scarier to deal with. So while this card doesn't really have any offensive type abilities, unless you pair it up with a card like Fusoya, this card is probably one of the strongest defensive cards you can have in the current metagame. So if you're looking to build a slower or more mid-range Earth deck and you want to have options to deal with hyper-aggressive decks, then Noctis is a great selection for that. Even without using cards like Fusoya, I definitely see a place for like 1 or 2 Noctis just to sit in your deck if you're playing Earth. So overall, this card is very powerful, and it's one of those cards I'm always going to be considering in the near future when I'm building any deck with Earth in it. Next is Bahamutian Soldier. It's a 2 CP forward at 5,000 power, so it's kind of on curve, but his ability is if you control a monster, Bahamutian Soldier gains plus 2,000 power. So 2 other interesting things about this card is that he's also a standard unit, and he's also category WOF. So those are 2 attributes that also have quite a lot of very interesting relevant support. So considering how we've had a lot of monsters be released in this game, now most decks should have access to 1 or 2 monsters that are actually relevant to their strategies. Now, if you're playing Earth, then a pretty good monster to combine it with is Cactuar, obviously because of the synergies with Dataluma. Now, Cactuar's second ability becomes a lot more relevant in the context of cards like Noctis. So playing any sort of Earth deck where having monsters on the field is relevant to your strategy, Bahamutian Soldier becomes a very cost-efficient 2 CP 7k forward to have on the field. Now, other little interesting benefits as well is like, of course, he's a standard unit, which means that he gets all the benefits of being a standard unit, such as you playing a card like Arc, but also because he's category WAF, he can be used to trigger off certain WAF abilities, such as being able to be brought back with TAMA, or also increasing the number of WAF cards you have on the field for a card like Huoyin. So overall, this card has a lot of good attributes to him, and he's a well-costed, efficient forward that you can put onto the field. So because of that, I think that this card is a very solid card, and if you're playing any sort of strategy that do want forwards of that sort of cost and that efficiency, then this card will be a good addition to decks. Next card we have is GEOMANCER. He is a 2 CP backup. Earth Dull, put GEOMANCER in a break zone, choose one forward against plus 2000 power until the end of turn. So this card is functionally the same as an Opus 1 card that we got called Monk, which does exactly the same thing, except this card has now been recreated with a new name. He's now called GEOMANCER, and his category has been changed to category 5. That being said though, there are certain cards that no longer get as much benefit out of this card as opposed to getting Monk. Typically the main benefit of playing Monk over GEOMANCER would be having a Yang on the field. So Yang is one of those cards that gets increased power or gets bonuses when you have Monks on the field. So in the situation that you are playing GEOMANCER, you lose that benefit. But if you're not playing Yang, then it really doesn't matter if you switch between the two. However, the reason why you would want to play GEOMANCER is if you want to take advantage of those category 5 bonuses. So that's, as we said, Bart and Faris, they're both cards that have bonuses for category 5 cards. So if you do want to go down those decks and you want to play those cards, then GEOMANCER is definitely a better pick than Monk in these scenarios. That being said though, both these scenarios are pretty niche cases for very specific decks. So obviously in those specific decks, they'll play their relevant 2 CP backup in those specific cases. Next card we'll be talking about is PRISHE, and this card seems pretty fun. She is a 9 CP forward at 9000 power, so she is below the curve and quite expensive. Her ability is that the cost required to play PRISHE on the field is reduced by 1 for each card named PRISHE in your break zone, and when PRISHE enters the field, choose one forward an opponent controls, deal a damage equal to PRISHE's power. So this card creates a situation where you want to run more PRISHEs in your deck in order to reduce her cost. And this works very well with the existing PRISHE archetype. We already have a 2 cost and a 6 cost and a 5 cost PRISHE, all of which synergize with PRISHE in some way or another. So starting off with 2 cost or 6 cost PRISHE, these are both forwards that allow you to play PRISHEs onto the field when they're destroyed. So even in the scenario where you haven't reduced PRISHE's cost all that much, you can still play her for effectively free if you have these effects trigger off. So how does the 5 cost PRISHE affect all of this? So the 5 cost PRISHE and the 6 cost PRISHE both have S abilities to them. So if you don't have that many PRISHEs in your break zone, or you want to use those PRISHEs from your hand to use a certain effect, you can always use Aurora Uppercut by the 5 cost one, or the 6 cost PRISHE's Nullifying Dropkick. So overall, all of these cards synergize with the PRISHE archetype very well, and I definitely foresee a deck where you want to be playing 8 or 9 PRISHEs in your deck to get used to this ability. That being said, even if you're not playing this PRISHE for free, if you play her for 4 or 5 CP, you're getting a very, very good amount of value. Being able to deal 9000 damage on entry is actually pretty strong, and that's if she has no buffs as well, which if you're playing in Earth deck, you're probably going to have some sort of ways to have existing buffs on the field, whether it's in the form of Enacross or Ingus, and hitting something for like 9k or 10k on entry is very, very powerful, as well as having a very strong body as well. So overall, while this card is definitely a card that you have to build around, and you have to build a very specific deck to take advantage of it, I do think that this is a very strong card. Also, another little side thing to note that this card is category 11 as well, which means this card is searchable by Star Sybil, which means if you do want to play a Wind Earth build for your Star Sybil deck, then PRISHE is a solid option for you to search for. Unfortunately, even if you can reduce PRISHE's cost, you can't play her using Star Sybil, but you can definitely play all the other PRISHEs using Star Sybil's ability. So you just play the other PRISHEs, let them die in combat, or let them die however they need to, and then you get to play this one for free. So ultimately, I think that there is a very good amount of support within this archetype, and also there are a lot of great cards slightly outside this archetype that also support a virus category as well. So definitely I think that this is a very viable card for local competitive play. Next card we'll be talking about is FLAN. He is a 2 CP monster, and he's Earth's equivalent for the discarding monsters in this set. So his first ability is put FLAN into a break zone, choose one forward. If your opponent doesn't pay free, it cannot attack or block this turn. And his discard ability is discard FLAN, choose one blocking forward against plus 1000 power until the end of the turn. You can only use his ability if FLAN is in your hand. By breaking him, you can force your opponent to pay free CP at the time that you break it. So your opponent doesn't pay free when they declare an attack or block, but your opponent pays free when you use this ability. So while this card doesn't technically stop a forward from attacking or blocking, sometimes you can play it in very opportune situations that causes the forward to not be able to attack or block. Additionally, if you find very specific situations, sometimes you can force your opponent to discard cards from their hand in order to deal with this card's ability. So if you happen to have quite a couple of forwards on the field and your opponent has only one effective blocker and your opponent doesn't have backups available to use to pay for this effect, breaking a FLAN in those very specific situations can sometimes cause your opponent to discard one or even two cards from their hand in order to allow their blocker to defend. So definitely towards the later part of the game, this card's effect becomes even more irrelevant, simply because your opponent will generally have more backups on the field and will have more resources to pay for this card's effect. As for this card's discard ability, it seems quite underwhelming. So if you consider the fact that it can only work on a blocking forward, it actually hinders this card a lot. The fact that it also only gives a plus 1000 power bonus is actually pretty weak as well. So there are only really two circumstances where this card would be useful in a blocking situation. It's either in a situation where your forward is smaller than your opponent's forward by 1000, so if your opponent has a 7000 power forward and you have a 6000 power forward, discarding this FLAN will allow your forward to increase its power to match the attacking forward and destroy it or trade in combat. The other use for this card would be if both your forwards are exact same power, and then you get to use this to increase your blocker's power by plus 1000 power and survive the block. Now, it's only in the very specific situation where both your forwards are at the exact same power where FLAN becomes better than the other discard cards. In the situation where if you're blocking with a smaller forward, if you were to have discarded Goblin, or if you were to have discarded Bomb instead, you would have been able to trade into a larger forward. So in those blocking scenarios, FLAN is weaker than both Goblin and Bomb, except in the very specific situation where both your forwards are at the exact same power. Now, the one thing about this card that actually makes this card significantly more playable is his name, the fact that it's named FLAN. And this is because we have a FLAN from a previous set that has the ability to search your deck for FLANs and add them to your hand at a very cost-efficient rate. So the Opus 4 FLAN allows you to pay 1 Ice Dull to put a FLAN from your deck into your hand, and because you've only paid 1 CP to search for a card, you effectively gain 1 extra CP. Whilst this was pretty limited in the past because the deck could only run 3 copies of that FLAN as the only FLAN in its deck, now the fact that you have 2 FLANs available means that you can potentially use that first FLAN's ability to gain a whole lot more CP over the course of a game. While this is a very deck-intensive strategy, it does have the potential to create a very nice engine where you can use FLANs to get additional resources during the game. And there already exists a whole lot of synergies between Ice and Earth as well, so I think potentially if you want to play an Ice-Earth deck, this might be something worth experimenting with. 3 copies of the Iceland and maybe 1 or 2 copies of the Earthland for an extra resource boost. The next card we'll be talking about, and this is a very exciting card, is MOOGLE FFCC. So it's a 4-cost backup. Its ability is job MOOGLE backups you control can produce CP of any element. So while this backup doesn't inherently generate any value, the fact that it allows all your MOOGLE backups to generate any element of CP is actually very strong. So there already exists a lot of cards within Earth that do require other elements to have their effects activate or give you bonuses or rewards for paying certain cards with multiple element types. So this new Moogle backup allows you to build a strategy where you can have greater access to those different element types on a backup that's generally much more difficult to deal with for your opponent. Not to mention, he also happens to be job Moogle, which means that we can look at some of these older Opus 2 Moogles that increase their potency depending on how many Moogles you have on the field. So cards such as Nono, cards such as Montblanc, cards such as Hurdy, these all increase their potential when you have more Moogles on the field. And obviously because this Moogle backup does encourage you to have more Moogle backups, definitely it's a strategy where all those Opus 2 Moogles can potentially receive more play. Talking about Moogles, there also exists a lot of cards that do support the Moogle archetype, whether it's in the form of Sarah or whether it's in the form of Chocomog. It's very easy and consistent for you to ensure that you're going to be able to have access to this Moogle as a backup. So overall, this card is a very powerful card. It does open up a lot of older archetypes. It supports a lot of newer cards, and there's a lot of support for it in the game that already exists. So overall, this card may not be consistent enough to build a competitive strategy around, but definitely in terms of a local competitive deck, this is definitely one of those decks that has potential to play very, very well, and it's definitely a very fun, interesting deck that you can take a lot of advantages of in a lot of cards. Next card is Monk. He's a 4 CP 8000 power forward. When Monk enters the field, choose 1 damage forward. If the cost paid to play Monk included lightning CP, deal it 5000 damage. So this card is really, really weird. I'm really surprised that this is a Earth card. It seems like it would have been a much more relevant card in, say, Wind or in Lightning. Because of that, this card is not very useful because Earth doesn't have too many ways to just deal small packets of damage to existing forwards. So it's going to be very difficult for you to, first of all, select a damage forward on the field because Earth just doesn't partially damage guys. Earth usually just blows guys up. So there's not too many situations in an Earth type strategy where you're going to be able to deal damage to a damage forward because your opponent generally doesn't have them. As for the payoff of this card, it seems pretty underwhelming. You do get a nice 4 CP AK body, but for 1 CP more, you have access to Orlando that just kills the forward, or for 1 CP less, you have Onion Knight that does exactly the same thing, but is also playable with a card called Alcid, and we all know how good Alcid Onion Knight is as a combo. So overall, Monk is very weak for what it does. There are better alternatives for him that are both more expensive and cheaper than him, and he's just very out of place within Earth itself, which doesn't have any reason to play a card like this. So there's no reason to play this card almost whatsoever in my opinion. And the final card of the set is YOJIMBO. He is a 4-cost EX burst summon. Choose one forward you control and one forward opponent controls. The former gains plus 1000 power until the end of the turn. Then each forward deals damage equal to its power to the other. If YOJIMBO results from an EX burst, the former gains plus 3000 power until the end of the turn instead. Then each forward deals damage equal to its power to the other. So YOJIMBO seems like a very weird mishmash between an existing 2 cards. So it's kind of like 2-cost Hecaton Care in that your forwards exchange damage, but it's kind of like 5-cost Titan in that it's an EX burst and you do get a buff on your forward as well. Similar to Monk before, this is a situation where this card awkwardly sits in the middle of 2 better alternatives, and because of that, I don't think it's going to see much play. If you do want to have an EX burst on a card, Titan is generally better. At the cost of 1 extra CP to cast it, Titan is significantly stronger than YOJIMBO because your forward doesn't receive damage, and if you were to just play it normally, your forward gets a larger buff. So in a lot of cases, Titan is better in YOJIMBO if you were to play it normally. Now, if you wanted a way to deal damage to your forwards, as well as to remove opponents' forwards to trigger off certain abilities, as well as removal, 2-cost Hecaton Care is a much more efficient way to do that as well. So if you want to trigger off like a card like Zaid, or if you want to trigger off a card like Dataluma, then Hecaton Care is a very cost-efficient way to trigger off that ability. YOJIMBO, you're paying an extra 2 CP for 1k worth of buff and potential for EX burst. So in both these scenarios, definitely YOJIMBO is weaker than their alternatives. So because of that reason, this card seems quite weak, and I don't see any reason why you would want to play it in competitive play, as opposed to 2 existing alternatives that are already in the game.
So guys, what do you think? Were there any cards that are overrated or underrated? What cards do you think that I might have missed something out on, or what cards do you think that I might have judged a little bit too harshly? Do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the description below. If you have any cool ideas, do feel free to share them as well. I do love hearing feedback from you guys. If you guys enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I'll be putting out a whole much more content about the Final Fantasy TCG in the near future. I hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time, Grand J out.